There comes a moment in life when you realize something very unusual about communication, that the strongest message you ever send is not the one you speak, not the one you explain, not the one you defend, but the one you stop repeating. Because words, no matter how carefully chosen, always have a limit. They can be misunderstood, ignored, twisted, or even forgotten. But silence carries a different kind of weight. It does not ask for attention. It naturally commands it. At first, people underestimate your silence. They assume it means weakness. They think you are hurt, confused, or maybe even defeated, and they become comfortable in your quietness, believing nothing has changed. But what they do not realize is that silence is never empty. It is filled with awareness. It is filled with observation. And it is filled with decisions that have already been made internally, even if they are not shown externally. When you used to explain yourself all the time, people did not truly listen. Not because they could not hear you, but because they never felt the need to understand you deeply. Your constant availability made your words feel less valuable. Your explanations slowly turned into background noise, and the more you tried to clarify yourself, the more your message lost its real impact. Then something begins to shift. You stop repeating yourself. You stop chasing understanding. And you stop trying to fix what was never being respected in the first place. And that is when silence begins to speak. Not loudly like words do, but deeply like truth does. Because silence forces reflection, it creates a space that words used to fill. And in that space, people are left alone with their assumptions, their interpretations, and most importantly, their realization of your absence. Absence has a strange effect on the human mind. It does not only remove presence, it increases value. What was once taken for granted suddenly becomes noticeable again. They start to see that you are not reacting the same way anymore. You are not explaining. You are not defending, and you are not emotionally available whenever they want. And that shift creates discomfort, not because you are doing something loud, but because your silence breaks a pattern they were used to. In that discomfort, thoughts begin to grow. What changed? Why are they not responding like before? Did I lose access to something I never appreciated properly? And these questions do not appear when you are speaking too much. They appear when you are no longer speaking at all. Because silence is not only the absence of words, it is the presence of boundaries. It is an unspoken message that says, I no longer need to convince anyone of my worth. And that is where your real power starts to return. In the beginning, people expect emotional reactions from you. They expect explanations, and they expect you to continue proving, fixing, and adjusting. And as long as you stay in that cycle, they remain comfortable. But the moment you pull your energy out of that system, the system slowly collapses, not in a dramatic way, not instantly, but quietly. And that quiet collapse is what makes your silence louder than anything you ever said before, because now they are no longer reacting to your words, they are reacting to your absence, and absence becomes more powerful than presence when presence was once constant. When someone is always available, their presence feels normal, expected, and predictable. But when that presence suddenly reduces even slightly, it creates a gap. And the human mind does not like gaps. It tries to fill them by replaying memories, rethinking conversations, and searching for meaning in things it once ignored. This is where your silence starts changing the story. Not because you are controlling it, but because you are no longer interfering with it. And there is a clear difference between those two. When you were speaking, you were actively shaping how people saw you through explanations and emotional effort. But when you become silent, you step out of that process completely, and people are left alone with their own interpretation of who you are, and more importantly, who you are without their attention. That is when curiosity replaces certainty. And curiosity is far stronger than attention because attention can be given freely, but curiosity must be earned through absence and silence. Your energy becomes harder to read, and what cannot be read becomes interesting. What becomes interesting starts gaining value, and what gains value starts being reconsidered. But the deeper truth most people miss is that your silence is not really for others, it is for you. It is the moment you stop wasting energy on situations that do not return it. It is the moment you stop trying to be understood by people who are committed to misunderstanding you. And it is the moment you choose inner stability over external approval. And in doing so, you completely change how you are experienced. You're no longer reacting emotionally to everything. You are observing, you are choosing, and you are filtering what deserves your response and what deserves your distance. And that distance creates a new kind of respect that words could never create. People do not respect what they can easily control. They respect what they cannot predict anymore. And silence makes you less predictable in a powerful way, not chaotic or emotional, but calm and grounded. There is something deeply unsettling in a meaningful way about a person who used to explain everything, suddenly choosing not to explain anything anymore, because it forces others to adjust their expectations. It forces them to realize that access to you is not automatic, not guaranteed, and not something they can assume anymore. And once that realization happens, your silence becomes louder than any argument you could ever make. Arguments fade, words are forgotten, and repeated apologies lose their weight over time. But silence leaves a lasting mark in awareness. It sends a message that something has changed and it is not temporary. And people can feel that even if they do not openly admit it. When your energy shifts from available to selective, from reactive to calm, from explaining to observing, everything around you starts adjusting to that version of you. Some people feel discomfort, some feel curiosity, some feel loss, and some only then begin to see your value in a way they never did when you were more available. But by that point, you are no longer in the same emotional position because silence does not only change how others see you, it changes how you see yourself. You begin to understand that not every situation deserves an explanation, not every misunderstanding deserves your energy, and not every silence from others requires your reaction. And you start realizing that peace does not come from being understood by everyone, but from no longer needing to be understood by everyone. That realization changes everything, because once you feel the power of silence, you stop fearing it. You stop rushing to fill it, and you stop thinking it means loss. Instead, you start seeing it as structure, control, and emotional discipline. Over time, you notice that you are no longer chasing clarity from others. You are no longer over-explaining your intentions, and you are no longer trying to fix emotional distance created by someone else. You simply exist in a state where your silence communicates more clearly than your old words ever did. And strangely, that silence is understood more clearly than anything you used to say. Once silence becomes part of your behavior, it stops being a reaction and slowly becomes your natural state. You no longer choose silence just to prove a point or create distance. You start living in a way where unnecessary explanations feel strange to you. You begin to see how much energy you once spent trying to make people understand you, and how little of that energy ever returned anything meaningful. And at that stage, your silence is no longer emotional, it becomes intentional, structured, and calm. This calm presence changes how people see you, because they can no longer easily predict your reactions. They can no longer assume every action will get an immediate response, and they can no longer depend on you filling every gap with words. And when predictability disappears, attention naturally increases. Not because you are trying to attract it, but because uncertainty naturally pulls awareness. There is a clear shift in perception. Earlier, you were seen through your responses. Now you are seen through your absence of responses. Earlier, your value was measured by how much you explained. Now your value is measured by how much you no longer feel the need to explain. This shift is not something you announce. It is something people slowly feel over time. Silence starts acting like an emotional mirror. It reflects back what others avoided noticing when you were speaking. When you were explaining, people could focus on your words, agree, disagree, ignore, or argue. But when you stop explaining, they are left alone with your absence. And in that absence, their thoughts become louder than your words ever were. They start replaying moments that once felt normal. They start attaching meaning to details they ignored. And your lack of reaction becomes part of a new story in their mind. But what they are reacting to is not silence itself. It is the emotional space your silence has created. And that space feels uncomfortable because it removes control. When you were constantly speaking, others had a sense of control over the interaction. They knew what to expect, they knew how to respond, and they knew how to guide the conversation. But silence removes all of that structure. It removes predictability, and it removes emotional access. And when emotional access becomes limited, curiosity naturally increases. But silence is not only about how others react, it is also about how you change internally. Because when you stop constantly projecting energy outward, you start turning it inward. You begin noticing habits you ignored before. You start seeing how often you spoke for reassurance instead of communication, and how many conversations were actually about validation rather than understanding. Once you see that clearly, something inside you begins to simplify. You stop feeling the need to explain everything. You start realizing that not every thought needs to be spoken. Not every feeling needs to be justified. And not every misunderstanding needs immediate correction. This reduces emotional urgency. You stop reacting instantly. You begin pausing more, observing more. And in that pause, clarity begins to form. Because silence gives you distance from emotional impulse, and that distance creates understanding. You begin to see people through patterns instead of moments, through actions instead of promises, and through consistency instead of charm. Once patterns become clear, emotional confusion loses its grip, and silence becomes protective instead of reactive. It protects your peace, your focus, and your emotional stability. Slowly, you become less available for situations that drain you, not to punish anyone, but because your system no longer accepts unnecessary emotional chaos. This shift does not come loudly. It comes as distance, a quiet distance that gradually becomes permanent. People may not understand it at first. They may think it is temporary, but over time, they realize something fundamental has changed in how you engage with life. Some begin to miss your explanations more than your presence because explanations once gave them access to your mind, and now that access is gone, others start respecting your silence even if they do not fully understand it, and a few only realize its meaning when it is too late. But at this point, you are no longer seeking validation. You are no longer dependent on acknowledgement, and you are no longer measuring yourself by who stays or who leaves. Instead, you observe everything with clarity rather than emotion. Silence becomes less of a strategy and more of an identity. It becomes your natural response to emotional overload, unnecessary conflict, and misaligned energy. You no longer force silence. It begins to choose you whenever words would disturb your peace. Your communication becomes selective. You speak when it adds value. You stay silent when it protects value. And you step back when presence no longer aligns with peace. This selectivity reshapes your entire emotional world. because your energy is no longer scattered everywhere. It becomes focused, preserved, and stronger over time. Emotional urgency starts to fade. Situations that once felt overwhelming now feel manageable. And you realize not everything requires an immediate response, and not every silence from others is a crisis. This creates mental stillness that is not dependent on external conditions. And that stillness becomes your new foundation. From that foundation, everything looks different. Conversations feel different. Relationships feel different. And even your thoughts become more organized and less reactive. Slowly and without any announcement, you evolve into someone who no longer communicates from emotional overflow, but from emotional control. And that control is not restriction, it is choice. The choice to speak or stay silent, the choice to engage or step back, and the choice to explain or remain quiet. And when choice replaces pressure, everything becomes intentional, and intention is where real emotional strength lives.